demands and policies. First of all, we're going to just see where everyone in the room is, because it's always different depending on where we go. So if you want to, we're going to see how you voted in the European referendum. If you don't want to, you just keep your hand down. You don't have to tell us. But let's get a broad sense. Who voted to remain in the European Union? Okay. Who voted to leave the European Union? Okay, so slightly less, but we've got a mixture in the room, so that's good. Who didn't vote? Okay, a couple of people didn't vote as well. Okay. So what I want to do first of all, if people are up for it, and I'd like people from both sides to say something, is just to tell us why you voted in the way you did. Just a short description. Does anyone want to? Go on, yes.
Hi, I like the idea of the countries moderating each other, so that if one country has a leader who's a tyrant, that they're answerable to the other countries and not just their own citizens. So I thought that moderation was very important, and I'm sorry that we'll be losing that.
Okay, thank you.
I voted to leave. I think the experience which Europe has imposed upon the Greek people has been abysmal. I think that the European Union is undemocratic as a set of organisations. People can't influence it and change it in a proper way. I think it serves the interests of transnational capital and embeds that interest so that people can't have their own sovereignty and control what happens within their borders. And ultimately, I think it was for a fortress Europe which excluded non-Europeans and therefore had a racist element to it.
Okay, thank you. Oh, you didn't vote, so yeah, let's hear why you didn't vote.
Oh, well, I didn't vote because I believe the companies that actually fundamentally organise the elections and stuff are still from pre-colonial and what have going further back. It just rebranded, and I don't feel that political or that form of social organisation represents me at all.
Great, thank you. That was really good to have those three. Anyone else want to chip in? We're happy with that? Okay. So it's really interesting because I kind of agree with a lot of what all three people said there. I mean, I made my decision based on tactical reasons, but there's an awful lot of stuff that however we voted, we share in common in terms of where we're going. And the really terrifying thing for me at the moment is the way that single vote is being used to take the country down a specific path that even many people who voted Brexit do not want to see and don't believe in. But it's becoming increasingly the case that Brexit means whatever Theresa May wants it to mean. And far from allowing people to take back control, it's being used to remove control for people. And so what this session is about is trying to think how we can reverse that situation. And it's definitely not easy because this vote has created an enormous division within those of us, even within the left, within those of us who want a better world. We find it very difficult to overcome the divisions that were created by that referendum. But I would argue that we need to, because our opponents have overcome their divisions and are steering the country in a really dangerous direction that I'm guessing, because you're here, most people in this room wouldn't want to see and don't want us to be going towards. I think there were people who voted Remain because, like me, they're internationalists. They like the idea of working together with other countries. They believe in a kind of openness towards immigrants, and they're anti-racist, and they believe there are some issues that we can only deal with at a bigger level than the nation state. So I would say they voted Remain for the right reasons. There were also people who voted Remain just because a lot of big businesses wanted to vote Remain and thought they could make more profits by staying in the European Union. There are also people who voted to leave because they feel their voice doesn't matter in our society anymore, because huge parts of this country have been deindustrialized. Parts of this country have been impoverished by a set of by an economy, by an economic system, and by corporations and institutions that don't really care about them, that aren't interested in their voice. And whoever they voted for the last 30 years, it hasn't made an awful lot of difference to their lives. I think a lot of those people probably just wanted to give the establishment a bloody nose, and there are other people who believe we can really start creating something better. So they're the people I would say voted Leave for the right reasons. Those two groups of people have a lot of principles and values in common with one another. And how can we build that into a kind of program that we can begin working for and mobilizing for and trying to bring about? And we absolutely need to, because the type of Brexit that's now being pursued by Theresa May and this government, although they don't spell it out very clearly quite often. I mean, she seems to be running a campaign based purely on sound bites at the moment, with no real policy whatsoever. But just to give you an idea of the kind of Brexit they want, we've got a little leaflet here. Show you these later, with Liam Fox, the Trade Secretary Liam Fox, one of the most hardline members of the government. This is what he said a couple of years ago. To restore Britain's competitiveness, we must begin by deregulating the labour market. Political objections must be overridden. It's too difficult to hire and fire and too expensive to take on new employees. It's intellectually unsustainable to believe that workplace rights should remain untouched. So he's quite an important member of the government. That's the kind of Brexit that he wants. And we know that there are people on the right wing of the Conservative Party who for years and years and years have said the problem with the European Union is all of these bloody regulations, environmental regulations, workplace regulations, and all the rest of it. And they want to use this opportunity to sweep them away. The problem for these people is not that the European Union is too capitalist or too controlled by corporations, but it's too socialist, which is something that in many European countries people find quite amusing, that we actually have members of our ruling class who think like this. But anyway, we do. So that's what they want. The other thing they want, and I think you can see this, we work a lot on trade deals. Trade is going to become a major issue over the next few years, because increasingly trade is not just about I sell you some fruit and you sell me some clothes. It's increasingly about the way that our whole economy is structured. It's increasingly about what kind of regulations we have, what room for maneuver there is for governments to make regulations that protect the environment and protect citizens. It's about increasingly hammering home a liberalisation agenda, which is about privatising public services and so on and so forth. So the trade deals are going to be really important, and we know that many members of our government are absolute hardline free traders in terms of wanting the kind of trade deals that force privatisation and so on onto societies, but also are quite willing to do trade deals with any government in the world, no matter what its human rights record, no matter what we're selling them. So Theresa May was the first leader to go and see Donald Trump. And she was talking about a trade deal with Donald Trump. That should worry us, because one of the things that if we do a trade deal with Donald Trump is going to want to get his hands on is the National Health Service, because American corporations have been desperate to get their hands on the National Health Service for ages and create a market in it. And Theresa May hasn't ruled out health being part of that trade deal. She flew from Donald Trump, just as he was writing the Muslim ban, to Turkey, to President Erdogan, who has locked up thousands and thousands of his opponents, including opposition MPs, and she did a deal with him to sell him £100 million worth of military equipment. A few weeks ago, Liam Fox went to the Philippines to talk to President Duterte, one of the most unpleasant government leaders in the world today, who talks openly about how he has personally murdered people, who is conducting a war on drugs, which means that thousands of his own citizens are being wiped out. Liam Fox went there and talked about the great shared values that we have with Duterte and the Philippines. And, of course, biggest on the list, they are flying regularly to the Gulf. So the amount of visits that the Prime Minister and senior members of the Cabinet have made to the Gulf in the last month or 2 months is absolutely extraordinary, and they absolutely want to do trade deals with those countries, including Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and so on, not just because we sell them a lot of weapons, of course we do, but also because they want to trade in healthcare, they want to talk about intellectual property, all of these other things that are part of trade deals. So that's a worry. And then I think the final thing about the type of Brexit they want is they essentially want to begin, I mean, as we leave the European Union, we are going to have to rewrite our constitution, because our constitution, although it's not written, depends very heavily at the moment on European institutions. So we're going to have to rewrite a lot of that. And this government is extremely, from what we've seen so far, is very interested in limiting the opposition in Parliament and opposition in society and any kind of checks and balances to government policy. And one particular thing that I want us to talk about is the Great Repeal Bill. Here we have Theresa May as Henry VIII, because the Great Repeal Bill is the bit of legislation that they're going to bring in. It would probably already have been announced next week if a general election hadn't been called. It will be announced in the next Queen's speech. What the Great Repeal Bill aims to do is transpose all European law, which is thousands of individual bits of laws and regulations and directives and all the rest of it, into British law, so that all of the law we still have all of the relevant law on our statute books. We don't just have a massive black hole of law the day after we leave the European Union, turn it all into British law, and then we can work out what laws we want to keep and what laws we want to change. Sounds reasonable. Might be no other way of doing it. The problem is there is such a huge extent of regulations and laws in there covering absolutely everything you can imagine, from how many holidays we statutorily are allowed at work and maternity pay, into the cleanness of our beaches, and through to basic human rights. There's so much in there, and in order to get this through Parliament in a reasonable timescale, they're going to have to give massive amounts of power to the government, to government ministers, to make individual decisions about how that law is transposed. And the thing we're worried about is that's not just going to be a technical process of changing EU to Britain. When you make those decisions, you will be making substantive decisions about what happens to those laws when they're transposed. So we're really worried that as part of the Great Repeal Bill going through Parliament, huge amounts of powers will be given to ministers to decide important bits of regulation and legislation that affect all of our lives. And one of the ways that this is being done is through something called Henry VIII powers. Henry VIII powers are something we have in our constitution, our unwritten constitution, because it's so archaic. Even when Henry VIII introduced these powers, they were controversial. So they're really controversial today. And they essentially allow a minister to make primary legislation without approval or debate. So we're worried that in the Great Repeal Bill, there will be substantial use of these Henry VIII powers, which in many countries wouldn't even be constitutional, in order to transpose this legislation. So we're going to have a hell of a fight on our hands when it comes to both the Brexit negotiations themselves, but all of the other individual laws that are going to be brought to Parliament, including the Great Repeal Bill, but there's also going to be an immigration bill, there's going to be a trade bill, there's going to be a farming and agriculture bill. There's going to be about 12 major pieces of legislation which are going to rewrite, essentially, the British Constitution. And I think the reason Theresa May has called an election now, and she's been quite honest about it in many ways, is that there were too many people causing too many problems for her in Parliament. I mean, she was quite explicit that the Liberal Democrats and Labour MPs and the SNP were not committed to the kind of Brexit she wanted, and they were and they were trying to oppose her and cause trouble in Parliament, which is the point of Parliament and is the point of having opposition parties. So she's explicitly called this for the reason of trying to reduce opposition as much as possible, and we'll come back to the election in a minute. So what I want is either individually talk about it for a little bit, and then I'll take some whatever you come up with. You can, if you want to think about it on your own, you can think about it on your own. That's okay as well. I'm not going to force you to talk to anyone. For you, what would a progressive deal look like? So I accept a lot of you in the room voted to remain in the European Union. and probably aren't happy about leaving the European Union at all. But nonetheless, if we are to pass a number of bills that say this is what our country is going to look like outside the European Union, what are the most important elements? What are the things you most want to retain? What are the things you most want to change? What would a progressive deal look like? Kind of have a think about what the top one thing, two things, three things are on your list. Talk to someone else, see if you can come to an agreement on it. I'm then going to tell you what we think, but part of the reason of doing this is because we're trying to get opinions from all around the country to see what people think is most important, to see what we think people will mobilise around when it comes to trying to call for a progressive deal. So either individually or in ones or twos, or whatever you want. And I'll give you 5 minutes. Yeah, introduce yourself to the person next to you, because it's all about networking too.
Total deregulation of trade unions, of the abolition and locking up if we can't shoot them. Privatize the health sector, simple as just abolish it. They are low taxation increase. Deal with someone thinks that if we get wealthy people pay less tax, they'll be more honest about what they'll declare. So how about British government taking control of the Crown Colonies, which are tax havens? Channel, Islands, Gibraltar, Seychelles, Bermuda. So actually tighten up and make sure that there are no tax havens. If we're talking about control, to take control of that. I don't know. Stopping HMRC and sweetheart deals. Sounds like a Labour manifesto. Well, I might have written a Labour manifesto, you don't know. Certainly, something sort of legislation in terms of media. One of the questions we complained not only to constantly for about 30 years, the cabinet as well. So the proper legislation about what press can say, what you can't say, and who owns it. What should be the constitutional relationship between the UK and the EU? My understanding, I've read the government which the Senator took oath in which they actually seem to have but they are going to adopt the legislation. Now my understanding is that they're going to adopt the wholesale and over a period of 20 to 30 years is sort through what they want. They can use the instruments. Guess who's going down here?
Right, okay. We've had a little bit of time to get to know each other. Does anyone want to tell me something that, I mean, it could just be stuff that you're worried about, right? It could be stuff that you're really scared we're going to lose, or it could be stuff where you say, no, actually, we want to change this.
Free movement across borders. I think
That's one thing you
ought
want.
to be able to retain complete free movement across borders.
I agree. You've picked the hardest one to argue for in society at the moment, but I agree, and it's part of what we're calling for.
In terms of fears, also how we're going to fund things like our healthcare when we have so many EU workers, and kind of ties in with that.
Which ties in with the freedom of movement point. Yeah.
The Eurogroup, I think that there's too much capitalistic override through, it's basically the powers behind the scenes that I'm worried about, rather than actually those that we can actually see and know, the politicians and the European Council and what have you. It's the Eurogroup and the IMFs and, those are the people I think, because at the end of the day, the way I look at, and the reason why I didn't vote and say it didn't represent me is because I think every human has got a right to live a really decent life. And wealth, compounding wealth, and it's just it doesn't sit well with me. So, and I feel every political system, I don't agree with the political funding system either. So that's the whole reason I totally abstained. So yeah.
So you're almost saying that one of the things that you'd want to see in terms of how it's different is an economy less tied in with international capital or corporations or. Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Where, just like you say, like Europe where people are considered first before wealth compounding of wealth. No, so pretty much.
Yeah, that's a big thing. Anyone else? It can be specific, it can be general like that, it can be hopes, fears. Climate, yes, please.
Climate change, all those things that I think we would like to cooperate with our neighbours in terms of positive management of the environment.
Yeah. Anyone else? Oh, sorry. Yeah, go for you and then you.
Well, I think what I would like is there's a lot of regulations in Europe to do with promoting competition and allowing free competition between European countries and different companies, which then stifles the ability to renationalise industry. So I would want those repealed and the ability to have these industries taken into public ownership.
Yeah. Down at the front, Owen.
It's purely and simply, if we're going to leave Europe because people think it's undemocratic, let's have proper proportional representation, get rid of the House of Lords and make that elected, and make our whole governmental system more transparent. I think when you were talking about Henry VIII laws, you were talking about the use of statutory instruments, which means that they can do things in dark rooms without us knowing what's going on.
Yeah.
If it's about democracy and it is about control, let's have it done properly. And I hate to say this, I'm a Republican. Let's get rid of the monarchy as well.
You've got a lot of support in the room, yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, very basically, workers' rights
Yeah.
need to be protected, and at least at the level that they have been protected by Europe.
Yeah.
Also, worker representation on company boards, things like that.
Yeah. Great. So, I mean, I think most of what's been talked about here is basically covered in the points that we've put together. The first one, and I think it's really important to have this programme of what kind of society we want to build as well, because regardless of what happens in the end, it looks like we're going to leave, but even if we re-enter the European Union or we don't leave, we as a left need to think clearly about what kind of society it is that we want to build. So the first one we've got is definitely rights at work, because there is immense opportunity for the government to reduce, as you heard from Liam Fox's quote, some of the working time directive, the maternity and paternity pay, the paid holiday, the protection of agency workers, holiday rights, all of that kind of stuff is in there and will be will be covered by the Great Repeal Bill. So workers' rights is essential. Secondly, the environmental protection one, both in terms of some of the, the clean beaches and that kind of stuff that's in European regulation, but more generally a commitment to fighting climate change with other countries is really essential. Thirdly is exactly your point about freedom of movement. It's going to be the most difficult one at the moment because of the wave of anti-immigrant sentiment that exists in the country. But I think we've got to start arguing for it. I think one of the reasons that so many people blame immigrants for all of our problems. I mean, it's an easy thing to do in any economic crisis in history. This has been something that's happened, but it's not been helped by the fact that leaders of both the Tories and also the Labour Party have repeatedly said to people, we will reduce immigration because immigration is a bad thing. And there's never really been an attempt to put forward a positive view of immigration and how it's beneficial, not just for us and our economy, but to enhance our society and for the people that are coming, especially if they're coming from other parts of the world that have been screwed because of policies that our government has put in place over the years. But the interesting thing about freedom of movement in Europe is, as far as I know, it's the only time in history that the right to move to different countries to work and to live and to get married and all the rest of it that we have in the European Union. It's the first time that has been seen as a human right, rather than a managed migration system which exists insofar as our economy would find it productive for it to exist. And I think that concept, despite the fact that I totally agree with what our friend at the front was saying earlier about Fortress Europe and the absolutely disgraceful way migrants have been treated by the European Union and the disgraceful things we see around the borders, I think that concept of freedom of movement is a really important thing to hang on to. And that's going to be a tough thing to argue for. Fourthly, human rights, and that we remain part of the European Convention of Human Rights, which is separate from the European Union. Theresa May, we suspect, we'll have to see next week, May put it in her manifesto that she wants to withdraw from the European Convention of Human Rights, which would put us in the category with Belarus, and that's about it in Europe. And then we have a couple of other points, one on education, in innovation and trying to ensure that we can still cooperate with Erasmus schemes and European funding for education and ensuring that young people who are in further and higher education have the opportunity to continue studying, working and forming relationships with other people in Europe. And then finally, a similar thing on science funding and ensuring that we still cooperate with European Union research and science and technology and so on. I think there's a couple of other things. So that's the kind of program for the progressive deal. I think there's a kind of a few other things as well that we may actually want to look at how they work and could they work better. One is how we support or don't support farmers in Britain, because the common agricultural policy is pretty notorious for not being a very fair system of supporting farmers, of farmer subsidies. That's partly due to how the British government interprets the common agricultural policy. But for sure, the major beneficiaries of the common agricultural policy in Britain tend to be very, very rich landowners, whereas we believe we actually should be supporting small farmers particularly. And then finally, I think what you said, the thing that brings it all together is democracy. If this is about democracy, then we actually have to have proper accountability, transparency and control over these decisions. And that could definitely be solved by some of the stuff that you're talking about, and I was definitely disappointed some of those things weren't clearer in the leaked Labour manifesto. But actually, there's some real basics. So when we're talking about trade deals and how important trade deals are to the type of society we live in, the type of economy that runs us. We have no say whatsoever in trade deals at the moment as the public. Our elected representatives have no say whatsoever when it comes to trade deals. Trade deals are negotiated pretty much under royal prerogative. We know that since the EU vote, 15 Trade negotiation working groups have been set up with government ministers and representatives from different countries. They include 5 of them, I think, are Gulf countries. They also include Turkey, India, the United States. MPs have no right to know what's going on in those trade working groups, how often they meet, who's coming to them. They have no right to set a mandate for how those trade deals are negotiated. They have no right to see the details of what's being discussed or to scrutinise them. When the trade deal is done and it finally comes to Parliament, they have no right to amend those trade deals, and they have no right to permanently stop those trade deals coming into effect. All they can do, if they're lucky, is halt them for 30 days. So that's a massive democratic deficit over a major part of our economic system and economic policy making, and that's got to be changed. That is something that was in the leaked manifesto that we saw earlier this week, that there will be democratic scrutiny and control of trade deals. So that's really important, because otherwise the kind of stuff that many of us were fighting against with TTIP and the EU-US trade deal is just going to come back in another form, and an even worse form. I went to give evidence to a parliamentary committee, the Parliamentary Trade Committee, actually, about a trade deal called CETA, which is the Canada-EU deal. It's a bit similar to TTIP, but kind of a bit smaller. It's not as, people aren't as concerned about it. I think probably because, Canada seems quite a nice place. Nice people. So we're not as scared of the Canadian model as we are of the American model. But of course, this is all about corporations versus the people, not us Europeans versus Americans or anything like that. So CETA is also scary. This Parliamentary Trade Committee has had 1 hour's evidence about it. That was the one I was at. That's it. And broadly, a lot of MPs on that committee seemed pretty much disinterested in how much power they had or didn't have over trade deals. In fact, one of them, Edward Lee, you might know Edward Lee, the Tory MP, said he was very excited because we will be able to negotiate trade deals much more quickly now. Unlike TTIP, which got bogged down for years and years and years, we'll just be able to negotiate them very quickly. And you kind of think, well, you probably will if you just do absolutely anything that the other party wants you to do, and you just listen to corporations and allow them to come up with a trade deal and don't allow any kind of public participation. So this question of democracy, I think, is absolutely central to what kind of Brexit we want. So the next bit really, and you can see these at the end, we've got the progressive deal worked out on here. We're also hoping to do some kind of meetings and conventions like this around the country to come up with a more kind of a people's progressive deal, if you like, something that people actually contribute to. But in the really, really immediate term, the campaign that we're working on is around the election. Use your vote to stop Tory Brexit. I think one of the things I'm sure we're all struggling with is how to get across to people at this time that democracy is the centre of what we should be talking about here. And simply the idea that Theresa May is going to negotiate the best deal for us just because she tells us that she is consistent on a consistent and repeated basis, and that she's going to be a bloody difficult woman to other European leaders is not in any way the point. The point is about how we can have a democratic discussion about what kind of country we want to build after the EU. And so what I'd like some help with today is, if you want to discuss again, what kind of, and I don't know if people has anyone here already been out canvassing? Put your hand up if you've been out canvassing or anything like that recently. So there's a couple of you. I'm trying to think at the moment about what kind of arguments you're likely to run into and how we can overcome some of those arguments, given that people are being told by political leaders and told by the media on a regular basis, this government will negotiate the best Brexit you can imagine, and we're going into an almost war-like situation, and we need a really strong leader like Theresa May to do those negotiations with us. How can we start to break down those arguments and get people to a place where they actually realise that their democratic rights are under threat, that really important regulations under threat, and to begin to get people to participate? Because I don't really like the phrase take back control, because I think, but it was genius. because it meant something very unsavoury to a lot of people. Take back control from foreigners as opposed to take back control from the European Commission or whatever. How can we get people into a place where they genuinely do see that control in our society for too long has rested with elites, economic elites, and so on, where inequality is growing and so on. And where, if we're going to do anything about this, they have a real responsibility now to start actively getting involved in shaping what kind of Brexit we want to see. So the question really is, if we're out on the doorsteps talking about using your vote to stop Tory Brexit, what are the kind of problems that people are likely to be throwing up? What kind of arguments are people likely to be throwing into your face? And are there good ways that we can get around that? And hopefully this is going to be useful for me, but hopefully it's going to be useful for everyone in the room, because if we're all out, collective wisdom is going to be really important here. If we're all out trying to convince people on stalls or knocking on doors or whatever of our arguments, we need all of our brain power to come together to try and make that work. So we're going to have 5 minutes on what are the kind of objections and how might we be able to start overcoming some of those objections on the doorstep, to see if we can help each other with the immense task we've got to set ourselves for the next 4 weeks.
Off you go then. One of the things that has come up is the things that people expect and why they think Brexit. The immigration issue is obviously, because I've been around quite a lot, and it's come up in the north. What I ended up saying to one guy was, Theresa May was Home Secretary for 6 years and achieved nothing. She expects to achieve nothing in terms of immigration now. The stuff that you had on how useful immigrant workers are and their sort of contribution, we need to have people more au fait with that, don't we?
I think it's a narrative where
the mere fact that immigrants aren't a problem.
government is
Yeah, I mean,
as credible.
there's,
I think which probably means
there's a lot of stuff around about immigrant workers in the NHS and massive contribution. So if you want to protect the NHS, restrict them. EU nurses being able to access the UK. Yeah. So it's difficult. You can't get into this
If you're out on a stall or on the doorstep arguing for people to vote against Tory Brexit and for all these things, what are the problems you're likely to encounter given the national mood at the moment, given where people are? Obvious one is there's too many migrants. Immigration is the real problem. We know the government's going to get this down. How do you overcome those? So it's kind of like, what would you imagine the top 2 or 3 reasons people will give for voting Tory or voting UKIP, and how could we begin to break down some of those arguments?
they're going to say Labour's too divided.
Yeah, I mean, and so you but I don't know if there's a quick way of getting there, because it's so. I mean, I think you say, if things get really bad in the UK, don't you want to be able to go to Europe to find a better chance? Well, for some people that might work, because it's a two-way. That would work in some places. Okay, to go over this, go to Cornwall. Cornwall had quite a high percentage of Brexiters. I think it was just short of 70% of the vote. When the thing was announced, about 2 days later, Cornwall is a unitary authority, so they had a council leader. Basically did a begging phone call and letter, but please make sure we don't lose our subsidies. Because apart from Cumberland, that is the poorest part of England. And people slowly, I think, have come out to the idea that a lot of their economy will work without the immigrant labour in the agriculture business. You're based in London, aren't you? Right. I go up to London occasionally. I I don't think I've been served coffee in London by anyone, by any stretch of the imagination of British descent for the last 10 years. They were what, Europeans or even further afield. And people have got to understand it's there in their face. It's not a problem. So Margaret Thatcher, Theresa May, putting this thing on immigration, I assume that she was planning to do what she sort of sees as a deep issue in the whole Brexit and the right view of the party. It's obviously, it is something where she can be shown to have failed. It's really my point. And what we need to do is number one, demonstrate that, and then simple. And I think the NHS is a good example about how would it function without immigrant workers. If you're over the border in Cornwall, how would your farms function? If you're in London, when did you last see someone, particularly in coffee shops, it seems to be, just loads and loads of immigrant labour? See, cleaners, office cleaners, you don't see it because they're usually in either before 6 or in after 7, aren't they? But certainly even when I was working in Exeter, all the office cleaning staff and worked in education, university cleaners, mainly by people either Filipino or Filipino. They might have been Bangladeshi, but they were all. I think people need to be able to anchor. People don't see these things, but the national health staff lived experience. They're sort of real life lived experience for most workers. It's stagnant wages, it's insecurity at work, it's the and it's worries about future public services, old age, yes, pensions, all of these things are. So I would want to move the terrain of talking about nebulous, don't see it type things about. Yeah, I suppose it's saying like, I think it's almost that question, what kind of Brexit do you want? What do you want to happen? And working back from that. So it's like, I mean, Paul Nuttall's banging the immigration stuff in it's like, okay, insecurity. What's the problem? You have to go one step beyond. I think you have to go to like, is it about jobs? And then make the argument around jobs.
Okay, let's see what people have come up with, and we can share. And part of the reason for this isn't just because we're coming up to an election, it's because I think on the left, this is a very difficult time for us. I mean, a lot of stuff that we've taken for granted for quite a long time is no longer being taken for granted by people in our society. And there's no doubt that the far right is seeing this opportunity as a great time for them to try and shift the narrative onto the terrain of racism and sexism and homophobia and all this kind of stuff, and to distract people and allow people to scapegoat for what are often very real social problems. So, and by the way, I'm not assuming that everybody in the room is going to be out campaigning for Labour or voting for Labour, but I'm probably assuming none of you are going to be out campaigning or voting for the Tories. In all of that campaigning, but for whichever party you're campaigning for, what are some objections you're going to get if we start saying, stop Tory Brexit, and these are the kind of policies that we believe would be a good way to take the country forward?
The British people decided to vote against it. I mean, don't know about anyone else, 42% of the population didn't vote. So we've got 30% voted out, 28% voted in. But are you really wanting to overturn this referendum?
But that's really important, because so many people are feeling they're being silenced at the moment by this idea that you're trying to frustrate the will of the British people, and I think it's going to come out a lot. So you've given some ideas there of how you begin to attack that narrative in terms of talking about the number of people who didn't vote and that it was a marginal vote and whatever, but there are other people who've had that argument who can...
Well, I think there are questions of disengagement from the whole issue.
Yeah.
A lot of people just don't bother their thinking about it. Yeah. They don't think it affects them. They don't think they can affect it. So it's a question of how you engage people in giving a shit.
Yeah. Yeah. And are the specifics that people want to bring up about that, how you do engage people around that. So either that this has been the vote, and you're trying to frustrate our will by talking in any way about any kind of policies that look like they might be anti-Brexit, or this idea here that I just don't want to know anymore, but I don't care.
Well, I can't affect.
Yeah.
Why should I care?
Yeah.
So it's how you get that message across of, well, it is going to affect you.
People might think whether you voted in or out, now is obviously the result has been we're leaving the EU, so they might feel that now isn't the right time to vote for a Labour government and everything changes. I've spoken to people that aren't necessarily strong Tory, but they're going to vote Tory in this election, get the EU thing out of the way, and then reevaluate like a Labour-Tory argument in the next election.
So that's really worrying, right? Because and I think you're right. I think a lot of people are probably in that space. Well, don't upset things at the moment. Let's just get on with this process, and then we'll. And so it's about how we can convince people the process is everything. Like if we just let someone get on with the process, our constitution's been rewritten not just for the next year, but for the next several decades. Anyone else on this kind of point, this general point? Yeah.
I think it's not about like throwing arguments at them. I think it's important to be empathetic and trying to understand in the first place why people like want to vote in a certain way, or like what are they, what is like the main reason why they vote that, like the origin of the way of thinking, and then like can lead them gently through asking questions, because I don't think you ever convince anyone by giving them arguments, because you just throw them against like a wall. But you have to do it more like engage with them, understand them, their views, then they might engage with your view as well.
So the point there would be if somebody, to try and understand the rationale that someone has for voting in a certain way, maybe you'll find out at the end of that, well, this person shares no values with me at all and I can't really go much further. But more likely, you'll find out they're actually concerned about public services, or they're concerned about some issue in their community, they're concerned about jobs, they're concerned about the amount. And from there, you can begin to take them on a path of, this is why this is so important. The process is so important that we're going to be following in the next few years, because it's going to affect exactly these things. Yeah. Anyone else? Other objections that you think people might have? No one's brought up the immigration question yet, which I think is going to be a big one in certain parts of the country. Yeah.
I think that's good that you're talking about immigration sort of as a thing, because in my experience, when people say that they're against immigration or we're full or there's not enough houses or whatever, as soon as you essentially enter into a conversation, not a hectoring sort of thing, but actually with them, sort of explain, no, it's not. And well, I'm coming at this from quite a far left sort of position, so when I say that racism and anti-immigrant sentiment is essentially a tool to divide and rule by the bosses and that, this is quite an argument that when it's explained to people seems quite obvious. So I've had people coming in and saying, no, we can't have any immigrants here, and then literally within a minute of having talked to them, they've like donated £5 to stand up to racism or whatever. So I think that one's actually quite, if you've got that strong principled argument of this is why racism exists, it's a tool of the bosses or whatever, then because it's true, that's quite a strong one to use against that.
Okay, anyone else had experience of dealing with that issue?
Thank you very much. I think on the immigration side of it, one of the problems was the Labour Party under Gordon Brown, when he let all these Eastern Europeans come into this country 7 years before he had to. And I'm fine with that, and I still think it's a great idea now, because it has benefited the economy and all the rest of it. But I think the problem was then, having let in these Eastern Europeans who didn't realise how money was going to come over here, Poles and all the rest of it, and where they would go. So clearly they went into areas that are now very anti-Brexit and UKIP and all the rest of it, because they didn't put the resources in there. So for me, the argument would be to say, look, we have immigrants come over here, they're good for the economy, they're good for everybody, socially and all the rest of it. But the problem lay in the governments by not putting in the resources to take care of the issues with housing, with doctors, surgeries, education, all the rest of it. Because we had people coming over here, they had priorities because there are a couple of children and all the rest of it there, so they're going to get priorities over housing and all the rest of it, but the government didn't put in the resources. And that's the kind of arguments you've got to go over to people. It's a big job, though.
Yeah, yeah. But so Labour in the last government set up a migrant fund, but it was pretty small. But it was there to try and do some of that stuff, so that when a lot of migrants went to a certain area, there was supposed to be some adjustment funds to help infrastructure in the area and so on. And then the Tories completely scrapped the migrant fund. Interestingly, they still charge the migrants coming in who pay for the migrant fund, but it goes somewhere else now. But absolutely, to talk about, it would be perfectly possible to create the kind of resources and political will to make this work for everybody. But this government's chosen not to do that. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Tim. I directed this film called Brexitania, and I'm talking at something next. In terms of, so I travelled up and down the UK, and I made a documentary about Brexit. One of the things I found quite surprising, and obviously this isn't a large part of the population, but for some of the people who I think are much more reactionary and always white, for some people I found there needed to be a conversation about actually what racism was and who it worked for, but then also why it was bad. Because to actually go back to these fundamental basics with some people, because I also, in terms of some people's new identities and their new activation around Brexit, and also this new white identity politics I think we're finding now in this new nationalist mode that we're encountering. There's this language about what racism against white people, and then this really changes the actual meaning of this word, and then results in us actually having to talk about systemic relations to that term, because there's been a sector of the white right that have taken ownership back of the term and made it meaningless in respect to someone doesn't take it as an actual bad thing to be seen as racist. That can also just mean for someone that they're a nationalist, which, depending how you look at it, might not actually be so bad, but also you can't, they're different things. I don't know if that refers to what you're asking, but it's just... Yeah, well,
it does. I think the interesting thing there is how you begin to convince someone this is not a good way of thinking, if you like. This is an antisocial way of thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's a guy down here. Oh, actually, I'll give you mine.
I think we're at a period of what I call peak Tory. We've got the Tory party divided by the big business interests, which actually wanted to stay in Europe. They were the Remain interests, and the Little England nationalists who wanted to leave. That disunity within the ruling class has been papered over, and they've come together and are presenting a united front at the moment, but they may well fall apart as the Brexit negotiations get underway, which they haven't got underway yet. We also haven't got the austerity. It's been happening for years, but it's set to continue and to increase. So we've got a period of peak Tory at the moment, and that's probably why they've gone to the country at the moment. It makes it an election in a very difficult circumstance, because if the local government election results were to be transposed into the general election, it would point towards a Tory victory. And what seems to have happened is the UKIP vote has collapsed into the Tory party at the moment. So she's got 4 million odd UKIP votes, anti-migrant votes, which are in the Tory bag at the moment. And that's a very worrying thing.
I think it's really interesting what you say there about the division in the Tory party, which hasn't really come to a head, but is there and will come to a head. And it may well be why there's an early election, because an awful lot of people on the more UKIP-y side who voted to leave the European Union, the vision that they have of a country is one of far more security. I mean, it might be nationalist and whatever, but it's one of a lot more protectionism in terms of international trade, public services, probably quite supportive of public services, probably quite supportive of subsidising farmers and all the rest of it. And that conflicts completely with the ideology of some of the leading Brexiters like Liam Fox and Boris Johnson, who are complete and utter free traders, who want to abolish all tariffs, who want to abolish all protection, who want to leave everything to the market. And there's a tension there that we can exploit in how we talk to people. But if we don't, and if we just leave it, the worry is the far right will exploit that tension, because there's no doubt there are people around like Aaron Banks who have been talking about trying to set up this new nationalist party and use his money to do that, because he knows that Theresa May will not be able to provide the kind of final settlement which is going to please a lot of the people who voted Brexit. So he sees those people as for him, that he wants to sop up those people who are bound to be frustrated by any final deal into a kind of new nationalist party. And I think for us, that's a massive responsibility for how we put forward an alternative, positive, to how we can have a country which absolutely meets the needs of economic security that many people feel in this new neoliberal economy where everything is extremely vulnerable, and you're supposed to, you've got wonderful flexible labor market, so you have a 0 hours contract and that you're just behaving like a freelancer, and that should all be wonderful. And you've got these people who are very worried about that and the way the economy and the economic direction's going. How can you provide those people with security while at the same time not turning to scapegoating and racism and all that kind of stuff? And I think the left should be better at being able to appeal to those people who want economic security than it has been. But that's why I think these conversations that we're going to be having over the next few weeks are really important. And the idea that it is actually possible to conceptualize the type of country that you want and to participate in a democratic debate around that is not just something which is, to be saved for later. It's something which is absolutely urgent now. And if these are the things that you care about, you need to get involved in this debate. And work to stop what the government is planning in terms of its hard Brexit or its Tory Brexit. So we've got some stuff here. Do take some of it away with you if you think it's going to be useful for your local campaigning. It really focuses on, hopefully, some of the issues, well, all of the issues really have been raised today around workers' rights, democracy, free movement, human rights, and so on. There's some stuff around the Great Repeal Bill and why that's a really frightening thing, and why this is absolutely not the time just to let the government get on with something, but to really all of us get involved. And if you're interested in this kind of thing and you agree more or less with the policies and you agree with the progressive deal and so on, then you can join Another Europe is Possible. You go on the website and join it, anothereurope.org, or leave me your name here. And we'll get back to you with some information about how you can get more involved. Another Europe is Possible has got local groups around the country. I don't think we've got one in this area yet, but we've got one in quite a few areas, and they're going to be out and about during the campaign with these campaign materials, hopefully pushing people towards a progressive vote. But no matter which way the vote goes, and if the opinion polls, as they're looking at the moment, are to be believed, and maybe we can turn them round, but if there is going to be a large Tory majority, a lot of this battle is going to have to be taken outside of Parliament, so that we can really begin building movements around certain parts of a more progressive manifesto and making people realise in the next few years exactly what's at stake. And I think even beginning to start toxifying some of the stuff the government is proposing, like the Great Repeal Bill and so on, will hopefully provide a basis for people to begin coming together and mobilising and building and campaigning and protesting about this kind of stuff, because that's what we're really going to need in the years ahead. Thank you very much for coming. I'll end there, actually, because I think it's only about 15 minutes till the next session, so you might want to get a drink or something. Thanks.